Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to this podcast or watching the video in case you are choosing between the two formats. My name is Alessandra Saviotti. I'm Toolkits editor of Decentralizing Political Economies platform. And today I'm here with Dr. Dani Admiss, who is a British, Assyrian, Iranian independent curator and researcher based in Edinburgh. Thank you, Dani, for being here with us today. I'm going to introduce you very briefly, and then we can proceed with a series of questions that I would like to ask you. So Dani uses social practices to develop projects with everyday communities to voice their stories and reimagine narratives of science and technology. She has worked with various communities to design immersive game environments that unwittingly extract data in exchange for public services, traced histories of water pollution in an industrialized waterway, created a bill of more than human rights, and set up an alternative ethics committee for ecological and cultural conservation. In 2020, Dani founded Sunlight Doesn't Need a Pipeline, an art community learning and climate justice project exploring just transition in the arts, with a coalition of art workers, agitators, dream weavers, growers, and caregivers. She has co-created a holistic decarbonization plan for art workers. As an outcome of this project, she's currently developing the Sunlight Liberation Network, a spiral economy for the art world's waste, which is super exciting. So I hope we will discuss also that. Dani has curated projects and published across the UK, Europe, and internationally. She's an Art Angel Making Time resident in 2023 and was a Stanley Picker Fellow in 2020. She has curated numerous exhibitions, conferences, workshops, and edited books in the UK, in Europe, and internationally. And she wrote her PhD in curatorial practice and word making with an AHRC grant. And she's a visiting tutor in design research at the National College of Art and Design in Dublin. So thank you, Dani, for being here with me today. It's great to have you.
Thank you, Alessandra. Yeah.
So the reason why I wanted to ask you a couple of questions in the context of DPE.tools platform is obviously because your incredible work around Sunlight Doesn't Need a Pipeline, well, and obviously beyond. But specifically with this project, I think what is interesting for me, it's its implication with the economy. And also because, well, you wrote a brilliant text that somehow responds to some of the aspects that we at DPE wanted to investigate after the 2011 roaming symposium. So I just wanted to start asking a bit about the project Sunlight Doesn't Need a Pipeline, and in particular, how it started, how it evolved, and where it's going now.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really such a pleasure to be part of this experimental DPE platform. Yeah, so you explained that Sunlight is an art, climate justice and collaborative learning project. And one of the outcomes is this holistic decarbonization plan, and people, freelancers or anyone can go on the website and have a look at some of the resources and case studies. But Sunlight started as an independently supported project as part of a Stanley Picker Fellowship between Stanley Picker Gallery and Kingston University. And that was in 2020. And it now sort of has grown to encompass an art and climate justice lab, a living roadmap, but most importantly, I would say, a sort of a community or coalition of different types of art workers. I was awarded the fellowship in 2020, and I always like to contextualize the project around the pandemic because, you know, at that time as a freelancer, so much of my world had been changed. So many of my projects had kind of been, or commitments had been cancelled or moved down the road to until later date. But also I've been given this substantial gift of a period of research, right? And then I was going to create some sort of exhibition at the end of it. But it coincided with COVID-19, and what I realized, you know, amongst all of the horror of that pandemic was that there would be no returning to normal. It was a sort of like real crisis moment where actually everything that we thought was normal, that was sort of invisible, the ways of the world, we kind of realized, oh, they're really built on unsustainable, harmful social processes or ecological processes, right? And Arundhati Roy has this wonderful way of talking about the pandemic in terms of a portal, that actually we have this choice to step through our world and reimagine it anew. And so I knew I had to change the fellowship in some way to kind of meet with that. So I went to the gallery and said, okay, using Arte Utils kind of like mantra, how can I be of use to you? Like, how can I use my fellowship to be of use? And what was so beautiful about that moment is that it completely decentered myself as the artist or the curator coming up with an idea. And I was just engaged in so much discussion with them about where they are at as an organization. And we ended up speaking a lot about the effects of public funding in the UK for arts organizations, austerity politics, but also this rise of carbon reporting or carbon accounting, and what that kind of new doctrine would mean in terms of decarbonization. And from those conversations, I kind of, the question, the urgent line of inquiry felt really clear. Like, what does decarbonizing a gallery look like? Is that possible? There was no kind of like literature out on, well, at that time in 2020, which I think is really informative in and of itself. And so from that, it kind of, that kind of refocused my research, and I was able to kind of use my co-creation methods and social tools towards that. And maybe just quickly to say about where we are at now. So we have had this kind of like 2 to 3 year project, which has brought together like over 150 art workers, local community groups, arts organizations. And the place that I'm kind of at in the moment is thinking a lot about the temporality of repair. You know, repair runs all the way through that project. What does it mean to be in relationships of restitution, of repair, of reparation? And I think it's such a gargantuan question, right? Like, even if so many worlds are ending, we're also being fed this narrative of that we're in this long age of repair, and this repair age is going to far outlast modernity, the Anthropocene. But you know, what does it mean to live with the mess that we're in? So we're thinking a lot about waste systems, how to take responsibility for that, and how might waste be a way for us to reimagine the forms of segregation and separation that have come along with modernity.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very interesting, because if I'm thinking about also a little bit the topics that we were trying to address through the symposium, for example, that was in 2021, like the question also of temporality was actually one of the topics that emerged from the conversation that we had. And I just wanted to transition to the second question, because basically when we invited you to be a respondent of this sort of, you know, like not really a manifesto, it's more a text where we try to condense all the topics that emerged during the symposium, for example, but rather to give like answers or like to formulate statements around what we discussed on what happened. We decided to ask other questions, right? Also like to kind of stretch the time of the project itself. So what does it mean to really engage in a long term, even in a conversation, for example? So you, for example, decided to address one of the questions that we wrote, which is how would we begin to develop more pluralistic ways of seeing, using, and participating in this complex and often hidden social economy? So why do you think it resonates well with what you have been interested in researching?
Yeah, thank you. Well, just for people watching this, actually the text that you gave me was so well written. It was so like solidified and synthesized such a big area. Like, economies are everything, right? But I really resonated with this question about pluralistic ways of seeing and being, and how to participate in economies from that. Because for the longest time, since I was a child, really, I've been really fascinated by the stories of science, of technology, of politics, how they tell society who we are or who we're supposed to be, and actually how at odds they are with our own lived experiences, not just on an individual level, but communities don't often see themselves in these stories, right? And so I'm always drawn to thinking about the plurality of our narratives against something called epistemic injustice, right? That we as a community, or when a community is not able to express itself, its subjectivity, to believe in to communicate their own beliefs and their kind of interpretations against some sort of bigger power. And I feel that that tension is so important when we think about climate, because actually something that I learned in the Sunlight Project was that so many people don't feel they have any agency over this issue, right? Where do we start? I have no idea. And so decarbonization, circular economy, zero waste, or all these kinds of stories that are supposed to save us in one sense, but also kind of they do oppress us in another. And I think in terms of plurality and pluralism, I think, again, that feeds into this feeling I had during the pandemic that, you know, life has been in the global north. These stories are normalized. They become invisible. They become like, oh, this is just the way that the world is. And there is no kind of moment for many people to go, actually, this is how I see it. And my tension is real with that. So how can I change it in some way? And so I was drawn to the question because I was thinking, actually, there is no fixed blueprint. Like, there's multiple paths to the same goal. And I feel that that really needs to be spoken about in terms of the creative arts sector, because actually so much of what we do is holistic. Artists are always making wholes, imagining future wholes out of the fragments that we have, right? But so much of that falls outside of what we deem the artwork or the art system or the kind of art exchange. So, you know, I feel like teasing and opening the idea of plurality or pluralism and the need for it against neoliberalism, for instance, and other kind of wounds or inequalities are really important.
Yes, yes, indeed. And I also, I think this idea of pluralism, and also, you know, like to kind of highlight that other stories are happening simultaneously, and somehow we don't see them because we cannot or we don't want to. I think this is a very interesting point that we were also trying to raise, which I think it's a good transition towards the next question that I wanted to ask you, because, well, obviously we are talking about texts, and for people that are watching and listening to this conversation, you can find both texts in the library section of the website. So there is a passage that you wrote, which I'm going to read, and I think it was one of my favorite. It is one of my favorite of your texts, which is: collaboration with various and diverse art workers embedded in marginalized contexts and whose stories need to be told was not about centralizing knowledge as a part of a curatorial impulse, but about weaving connections into bonds as part of an alchemical act of peer learning. So can you perhaps expand a little bit on this, because it's I think it's really crucial also for what we have been trying to do with DPE, for example.
Yeah, thank you. I think I might just speak about my motivation, and then I'm going to give you concrete examples of the things that I did and the things that didn't work, which, you know, all the challenges, because I think there are so many. And I think that also feeds into this pluralist. There are so many ways to do this kinds of work. So as I've alluded to, like, I call myself an independent curator, but really the thing that motivates me in my work are the relationships that we can build together. And I really believe in opening out that proprietary space of the curatorial, like where a curator is seen as an expert and comes up with a story or an idea. And actually, I've always wanted to find ways to make that collaborative, make that collective, that we matter through those questions together. And a big part of that for me comes from this idea that I'm not interested in knowledge for knowledge's sake, but like this idea of a collective knowing. Like, what does that mean? How can that awaken subjects? How can that influence change? And I see that so much in projects like that I run, like Sunlight, where actually it becomes about confidence and capacity building and literacy building. And I feel that there's lots of tools to do that, but there's no roadmap for it. So, you know, the alchemical peer learning that I'm talking about is, you know, it comes out of this experimental wanting to be together, to treating each other with relational integrity, which is why, you know, I always, when I talk about the project, I talk about how can I be of use to you? Because, you know, all of these little changes where every time I had a meeting with an artist, I'd be like, okay, well, what do you want from this project? Like, instead of you working for me, and just flipping those power dynamics, or giving people a sense that there didn't have to be a predetermined outcome, getting people to make the contracts. We didn't call them contracts, we kind of called them collaborative plans together, for them to decide how much they got paid, for me to tell them that I trust them, to know that they are embedded in other networks, and I didn't have to have authorial power over where these stories went or where the projects went, had like this kind of beautiful alchemy to it, right? Where actually at some point I realized that what we were creating were these solidarity networks as opposed to just the content, you know? And I was really lucky because Stanley Pickett Gallery were incredibly supportive and hands-off as commissioners. But also I've been doing this work for 15 years. So I was aware that it takes 3 times as much work to make a project that is supposed to be not curated, you know? And that's not remunerated in terms of wage labor. And I suppose I also knew, or coming out of the project, a new finding when working this way, I think, is that longevity and legacy is a real issue. Like you begin these deep connections, you open up this, or you create this kind of channel where people can be radically honest with you. And then the money stops or the money runs out. And you're like, okay, so how do I continue to honor this relationship? You know, and how do we keep that mutualism going, particularly as things are becoming really uncertain, and how uneven that uncertainty is, you know? And maybe just to say one more thing, I'm really interested in getting people, when thinking about the climate, particularly within the creative arts sector, to think about art workers. Like, what is our responsibility and solidarity with people that fall under artwork on the other side of the world, for instance, beyond borders? Because I feel that it's such a hermetically sealed, we just think of the art world as like our immediate group of people and this like weird circuit of biennales. And I'm like, well, no, that's, you know, more people are artists that will never get to travel the world than are those people. So what is our responsibility to that?
Well, thank you, Dani. I think we can actually leave each other with these questions, with this particular question, which is so important, especially because, as you were saying at the beginning, we all started our projects, like Sunlight doesn't need a pipeline, but also DPE in the middle of the pandemic. And we were also reading the same article that you mentioned about Arundhati Roy, about this idea of the pandemic as a portal. And now, after 3 years, which is not a long time, but it can also be a very long time, it looks like all the nice thoughts that we were sharing, well, I'm not talking about me and you, obviously, but in general, we forgot about that, especially in terms of sustainability of, for example, traveling. It seems to me that we are back to where we stopped for a second. And then, well, thank you for putting it on the table today again. We should definitely think about that. So, well, thank you, Dani, and good luck with the project. And yeah, hopefully we'll see in person perhaps in a couple of months. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.